The Holy Gospel this morning comes from St. Mark in the first chapter. Now they went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. And just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. And he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit convulsed him, and crying with a loud voice came out of him. And they were all amazed. And they kept asking one another, "What's this? A new teaching? With authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. The gospel of the Lord. May be seated. I have this fancy new microphone, so I'm really excited to. It's actually an old microphone, I just got it fixed, but those things are the things that make life interesting. So, on this particular day, I want to look at this little story here of Jesus. Early on in his ministry, he goes to Capernaum. Now, one of the things to remember about Capernaum is a relatively big town, all things considered. It would have been the big town for Jesus. Imagine if Nazareth was kind of like Blair, and whenever Jesus, as a young man, wanted to do anything fun, he would go to Omaha. Well, if Jesus, growing up in Nazareth, if he ever wanted to do anything fun, Capernaum was the place to go. It was right on the Silk Highway, which connected basically what we know as the Mediterranean Sea with China. So, it was quite a popular trade route. So, anyhow, he goes to Capernaum, and he goes into the synagogue. And this is an important thing to see, because I want us to sort of imagine what that would have been like. Now, basically what happens is after Solomon built the temple, the Jewish people knew where God was. The beauty of having God behind the Holy of Holies was you could just kind of say, well, God's down there in the Holy of Holies, and as far as we're concerned, that's good, because now he's not getting in the way of the stuff we're doing up here in Nazareth. But what happened is the Jewish tradition then developed what we would call synagogues or congregations. And people who lived outside of Jerusalem, say Nazareth or Capernaum or wherever, would gather together, build a small building, often in the round, and they would call it a synagogue, and it would be a place where they would be able to share scripture, share prayers, be able to gather as a Jewish people within their community. And of course, there was an expectation after a while that you would go down to Jerusalem on a fairly regular basis, especially for high holy days like Passover perhaps, or Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. If you could, but if you could not, you just gathered in your synagogue. And so the way the synagogue worked is on the Sabbath, which for them was a Saturday, they would gather together. Usually if you were in walking distance of it, less than an hour or two, you would gather on that Saturday, whenever the appointed time was. You'd come in, you'd sit on the floor. There were usually rugs or carpets or whatever, or you brought your own prayer mat, whatever the case was. Women sat on one side, men sat on another. And you had whatever scroll was available to you. Not everybody had a complete Bible, a complete scroll. Not every synagogue could afford that, but most synagogues had something. And then their appointed scribe would just sort of open it up and read from it. There would be usually a Psalms. The Psalms were often memorized, and part of how you learned how to read Hebrew was to memorize and read the Psalms. And then there would be some prayers, and then you would go home, and they'd take an offering, and then you would go home. Always take an offering. We are even taking an offering today. In fact, because there's so few of you, we'll probably take it twice. You'll have to make up for those who aren't here. So nonetheless, you're all thinking, great, way to go. So that's what it looked like. Okay, so now here's what I need you to do. Imagine with me, you can close your eyes if you want. Imagine that you are a Jewish person and you are in the synagogue that day, and this wandering a Jewish teacher comes in, this wandering rabbi comes in, and he has his friends with him. Peter, James, and John. Andrew is there as well, and they're strange, and you're like, oh gosh, we got visitors, great. And they sit down, and all of a sudden Jesus starts teaching. And that's legitimate. I mean, you could do that. I mean, if there was somebody who came who was a visitor who was a rabbi, he could definitely do that. Um, but he teaches a little different than your particular scribe does. He teaches like he actually knows what he's talking about, and your scribe doesn't always do that. But then you have this one guy in your congregation, and maybe you have one of these people in your family too. They sort of have what Mark calls an unclean spirit. Now, we're not quite sure exactly what an unclean spirit is. It could actually be a demon of some kind, but chances are that's not what it is, because Mark had a lot of words that he could have used for demon, and he didn't choose them. He chose unclean spirit. And so an unclean spirit, a lot of times, is kind of like how we would say, well, that person's just not right. There's something just a little off with somebody. And they're not dangerous necessarily, but you do know that, halfway through Thanksgiving dinner, Uncle Rob is going to do something ridiculously crazy, and everybody's going to say, no, we have got to keep him off the cranberry schnapps. So you have this guy in the synagogue who's just got an unclean spirit. And in the middle of Jesus' teaching, he just stops and he says, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us?" And Jesus, to his part, then says, "Get out of this man." And he does a convulsion, and he's healed. So now I ask you, you're sitting there, what did you actually see? Now I know what Mark said. There was an unclean spirit, and Jesus healed him. But what did you see? Did you see some kind of like ghost escaping from the guy and he floated up into the sky? Did you just see somebody flopping around on the floor like they were in an epileptic fit? What did you actually see? Well, what's interesting is that when Mark says what the people saw is, the people were astounded because they said, "Wow, what a great teaching. What a great teaching." So what they saw when Jesus healed this guy was a teaching. Now, how many of you have ever seen teaching before? Now, teaching is a different thing, right? Because teaching is somebody taking somebody else and helping them along. They're saying, "Oh, no, not this way, and try it this way. Oh, no, don't, oh, yeah, okay, that's good. Oh, that's excellent. That's exactly what we're looking for." That's what teachers do, right? Teachers talk. Teachers argue. Teachers debate. So I'm wondering if on this particular day, as Jesus wanders into that synagogue in Capernaum, that what happened was not so much some kind of miracle where some guy flopped on the floor and a spirit kind of went into the space, but instead, rather, Jesus and this guy had an argument. They had a conversation. And in the end, the guy realized Jesus was right. That Jesus actually had something to teach this guy. And so that unclean spirit left him, and he became a different man. Now, I thought to myself, wow, if that's what happened, then I have a lot more similarity with that guy with the unclean spirit than I originally thought. Because I don't really think I'm ever possessed by a demon. But I do know I had an unclean spirit. Because for a great portion of my life, I pretty much figured that I could do whatever I wanted. I was white, and I was male, and I was wealthy. That's pretty much a guaranteed success to do whatever you want. And so I figured that I could just go anywhere and do anything, and I didn't really need anybody's help, much less Jesus, much less God. I would make my own decisions and do it my own way, and most of the time I would win. Not always, but if there was ever a chance where it looked like I wasn't going to win, I would cheat. And then I would win. And I lived my life quite happily, I happen to say, for a long time. 25 years or so. But then I had some experiences where I thought to myself that perhaps I might be wrong. that perhaps my spirit might be a bit unclean. Let me tell you a story. I was in graduate school at the University of Texas. Yeah, many of you might know that. And I lived with some guys in Austin. And we decided one night to take a trip down to San Antonio, which is about 80 miles south of where we lived in San Antonio, Texas, to watch a professional basketball game between the San Antonio Spurs and the Los Angeles Lakers. And so my roommates had cars. I didn't have a car when I was in Austin, so all my friends were people who had cars. Even if I didn't know their first name, if they had a car, they were my friend. And this particular case, my roommates drove, and we drove down there, and we watched the basketball game. We had a wonderful time, actually. I got a little distracted. There were things that got in my way, and the next thing I knew, I looked around, and I was down by the Alamo with a couple of my new friends from San Antonio, and I went back to where our car was, and it was gone, and my friends had left me in San Antonio. I had about 30 cents in my pocket. My new friends that I had met at the basketball game were long since gone, and so there I was down by the Alamo, saying to myself, wow, 80 miles from home. I figured I could walk about 4 miles an hour on average, so I figured 20 hours, I'd be home by, 8:30 tomorrow night. All right. I don't know anybody else. My family, of course, all in Minnesota and stuff. So I just start walking north. I'm walking north through wherever streets and towns of San Antonio. I go for a few, maybe half hour or so, and as you're walking 80 miles, what would obviously make this situation better? It starts to rain. Yeah. So, because in Texas too, by the way, it doesn't, just rain a little bit. It's completely dry or it's flooding, right? So I was actually losing ground with every step I was taken back by the current. I was going to be in Mexico before I ever got to Austin. So I'm walking in the rain 80 miles towards home, and I'm in this neighborhood that I know I shouldn't be in. I mean, half the buildings are crumbling and despair, and nobody lives in them, and there's cars that are up on the sidewalks, and there's nobody on the streets. There's no street lights. They're all out. And I look ahead, and there is this one little light over a door with an alcove. And I say to myself, ooh, I can get out of the rain a little bit. So I sneak into this door in the alcove, and I get there, and there are 3 young men there. And they are standing there, and they look at me, and I look at them. And I'm older than them, even though I'm only 24 at this time. But they're really young kids. And so I say, ¿qué pasa? Hey, how you doing? And they had a bottle in a paper bag, and one guy says, what are you doing? And I said, I'm walking to Austin. And they just laughed and laughed. They said, it's like 70 miles. And I was like, ooh, I already picked up 10 miles. So I was really happy about that. So they were just laughing. And so I said I was getting out of the rain, and we started talking and whatnot, and just hung out with those guys for a couple hours and passed the bag around and whatnot. And finally, it stopped raining a little bit. And so I said, guys, I got to get up. I said, I can't waste any time. I got to go. And they said, seriously, you're walking to Austin? And I said, yeah. And they were like, come on, follow us. We'll drive you. And so I said, okay. So I followed them, and they started running, and we started running through the streets, and we got to this car, and they got into the car, and they said, come on. And we drove away, and in their car, I'm sure it was their car. I mean, most people who have cars, though, have the keys to them. These guys didn't actually have keys. But, that happens. They're young, they misplace things, so then you have to rewire things and stuff. I know that kind of stuff. So I'm sitting in the back of their car, and it was a relatively brand new Cadillac, too, which, surprised me, too, because when you're like 14, 15, not a lot of people don't start out with Cadillacs, but these guys did. They were entrepreneurial, I'm sure. And we started driving it, and I realized about halfway down the first block that I possibly could die. Now, I thought I could die when I was just first met them, but, that didn't seem too weird. But when they started driving about 100 miles an hour through the streets of San Antonio in their new Cadillac, I thought to myself, I may have made a wrong choice. So I just kind of closed my eyes, and the next thing I knew, I opened them, and I was in South Austin. And they said, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, "I just dropped me off at the university up by the stadium." And they said, "Okay." And I lived about a mile from there. And they dropped me off, and they said, "Hey, nice to meet you, gringo," and drove off in their fancy new car, no doubt to show their girlfriends, what they had done. So I walked that last mile home, and I got home, and it was 4:30 in the morning. And my roommates were sitting there going, "We forgot you." I said, "Yeah, you did kind of forget me. Thanks." It was at that moment, as I went back into my room, that I realized that maybe I didn't have all the answers. That maybe I should probably look somewhere else to find guidance in my life. Because if I was going to have stories like this, and I'd love to tell you all the stories, that's just one. But those are the kinds of things that happen to me on a fairly regular basis, okay? It is not extraordinary to hear that story from me after you've heard the other things I did over those 5 years and even before. Like, for example, once I lit a field on fire, and there are all kinds of stuff. Anyhow, I digress. Now, it just so happened, of course, that I grew up in a church. My mother was a church secretary. My grandmother was a church secretary, and we went to church all the time. And so as I sat and began to think about where I might find something, I began to listen to what Jesus wanted to teach me. And I realized that some of the things that I've learned from Jesus, of course, is that, for example, you don't always have to win in order to win. That it is okay to lose for the sake of a greater glory. Now, I got to admit, I'm still in argument with Jesus on that, but as long as Jesus is willing to lose, I'm willing to win. But he also taught me that, sometimes there is something greater out there than what you can just see or taste or touch. He taught me that there was a way to live with people that even though you might not understand what's going on and there might be a very oppressive, almost evil-like system going on, that you can't combat that with more violence. That eventually you just have to breathe your last and die. And as I realized it, then Jesus taught me a lot over the last 25 years. That a lot of what I've learned has come because Jesus has taken the patience to teach me. And when I look at it that way, that story of Jesus going into that synagogue in Capernaum and helping that guy with the unclean spirit makes a lot more sense. Because now I see. The psalmist writes, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." Sometimes to renew that right spirit is to be taught a different way of living. To be taught to rest and trust in the promise and power of God, even if you can't see it. So what have you learned from Jesus? What has Jesus taught you about how you live and act and behave and work amongst people in God's world? How has Jesus been your teacher? That's finally what Mark is asking of us today. What have you learned from Jesus of Nazareth? Oh, and one last thing. Y'all know what the Hebrew word for teacher is, right? Rabbi. Yeah. And it's a rabbi who went into Capernaum that day.